Hi, here's an extract from Woodworking for Beginners number 5. You can see the whole thing on my Get Into Woodworking channel.
So the first thing I'm going to do is mark the baseline for the tails and the pins. And this is how far down the piece of wood we're actually going to be cutting them. I'm going to do that with the marking gauge. I'll use the wheel gauge. Depth I want to go down the tail board is the thickness of what's going to be the pin board. And these are both the same thickness, so I can set my gauge from one of them and use it to set both of those baselines. And then you want to mark all the way round lightly on the, first of all, the tail board. On the pin board you don't need to mark the two edges. We'll put the pin board away for a moment. On the tail board we need to mark out the tails. What I tend to do is decide the slope of angle I'm going to do. On a softwood I'll probably do a 6-in-1, which is this side of my gauge. Hardwood probably 8-in-1, which is this side. Something that happens when you're doing a dovetail, say that's one of the tails there, there's the tail next to it, that's going to be the waist area. If you suddenly have marked it up, go to your chisels and find you don't have a chisel that's narrow enough to take that piece of waist out. So to make sure that doesn't happen, what I do is take my gauge with the right slope, 6-in-1, take the chisel I'm going to use, put the chisel actually onto the gauge line that I've just made on there, so that's the depth it's coming to, line it up with the edge of the board, move my gauge across, and I'll take that as the end pin. Mark that one in, mark it across the top, and I know that the method I'm going to use is going to make sure that the center pin is wide enough so I can get my chisel in. So I've marked for this pin on this end. Now I'm going to ignore that area completely and just divide the remaining area, so from here across to here, into the number of sections equal to the number of tails I want. I want to have 2 tails on this board, so I want to divide this area here into 2. So my dividers are a little bit too close together at the moment. And that's it. So I've divided that into 2. I'm going to end up with 2 tails. Now to mark where those tails are, I'm going to start first off right on this edge here. So move the divider across, make a mark, swing it round, make another mark. That'll show where that pin is on that end. Then come from this end here, right on the end, come across, make a mark, swing round, and that should line up with the pin line I've already got. Pencil in the hole, move the gauge along, mark across the top, and mark down the front. And the final one over here. Before we do anything else, let's mark what needs to come away. So this is going to be waist here and here, and then between the 2 tails. I'll mark it on the top as well. So very lightly, no weight on the saw at all. Enough there just to set the teeth in the wood so that the saw's not going to wobble about like so. The important point here is that your saw should be perpendicular to the wood. Next thing you've got to do is tilt it at the correct angle to match the guidelines. You might like to use a little piece of wood here, set it on the plate of the saw and just tilt the saw until that lines up with the mark. When you've got it like that, you can saw, keeping the saw plate up against that piece of wood. That'll just get you started. But really, once you've got that angle, if you just lock it in, just come down to the gauge line, The important thing is don't try and steer to that line as you're making the cut. Set the angle and stick with that angle. Now we're going in the opposite direction with these ones. So I'll set the saw, eyeball down the line, in order to chop the waste away between the tails, clamp the work down over the leg of a bench, and the immediate thought is, well, let's put the chisel into that gauge line there, that's where we want to cut it, and let's just chop down. If you do that, the bevel on the chisel is going to push the chisel back into the area we don't want to cut, and you're going to find that it gets crushed. So what we're going to do is start a reasonable way in from that line. Just make a slight cut, and then just take that out with the chisel as though you were making a knife wall. Then extend that a little bit deeper. Now we've got some material already wasted away now, so we can creep back with our chisel towards that line, taking a little bit at a time. And because there's nothing on the bevel side of the chisel, it's not going to force it back further than the gauge line. So I'm now within about 1/2 mil of that gauge line. So now I feel quite confident that I could put my chisel in there. I can drop that into the knife line. Being fairly confident that the chisel's not going to jump back into the work we want. So that's given a nice clean line at the base of that waist. And if we just deepen that slot, like so. As we go deeper, we can hammer slightly heavier. You see, I'm just removing the waste so that there's nothing for my bevel to ride up against and push the chisel back. So I reckon I'm halfway through. I can flip that board over now, work from the other side, and eventually that little piece of waste will become free. And you see that piece of waste is now free. We push it back in. We should be able to lift it out. And there's just a little bit of tidying up to do in there, which we can attempt to do some of that now. Don't chop all the way through. I always want to come from both sides, and actually undercutting on these is quite good because it means there's never any chance of binding up when you're trying to put the piece together. So having done that, we'll cut these edge pieces away. So back in the vise. Be good to reinforce those knife lines. Use a chisel just to make a little knife wall. Like so. Take your saw. And maybe you haven't gone quite deep enough when you've been cutting this way, so just gradually go in. You don't want to overcook either line. There we go. Invariably, because you've sawn it, there'll be a little bit of clean up to do. You can put your chisel onto the knife line, the knife wall. Run that down into the corner. But usually it's pretty good. Same on the other side. clean up right into the corner so it's nice and sharp. And if you're pushing the chisel this way along with the grain, it's really with just very little pressure, otherwise you could split the wood. And any final clean up, if you put it in the vise like so, you can then use the chisel, sit on the knife line and just clean up by paring across those joint surfaces. Things to watch out for at this point are that none of those surfaces, joint surfaces, are higher than the gauge line. So use a square on there just to make sure it sits nicely, it's not rocking at all. Check all those out. Make any adjustments that are necessary. But basically, that's it. You've got your tails cut, we're ready to do the pins. Now, the normal trick employed for marking out the pins is to use a plane on its side and use the vise as well. We'll set the pin board, this board here. Well, it's just, that corner is going to go together like this, I think you can see. So keeping it in that orientation, turn it around, put the pin board in the vise and put it down at the same height as the plane. Like so. Move the plane back and lift the towel board on top of the pin board. Line up the two edges. If you use the large stock on a square, just put that on there, that'll help you line up one edge. And what you want to have is barely, a little bit of light, barely visible along the joint line at the bottom of your tails. So you can see the barest amount of light just coming through that joint there. Everything's squared up nicely. So if I put some pressure on top of the tail board, stop anything moving, and get in there with a sharp pencil and mark for the pins. And something important here is the fact that all of this pencil line is what we want to save. We don't want to cut that pencil line away, otherwise the joint's going to be too slack. If I use the square now to mark down straight lines from where those lines are on the top. Pop that back in the vise. Now these lines, as opposed to the tails which were angled, these need to be perfectly plumb, so often quite an advantage to make sure that your tail board is perfectly plumb in the vise. Got the slope across the top of the pin here, got that set. Now we just want to follow this line down here, leaving it. And level the saw out. And the same with the other three. And in fact, I should have marked my waist before I started. So try and remember that yourself. My preferred method actually for removing material is to use a jeweler's saw. So we'll drop that down and I'll just, with it moving but not at the bottom of the cut, I start to turn it round so it's now cutting horizontally. And I'll just make my way across. And bear in mind that because of the angles on the top there, we'll need to change the position of this saw so we don't cut in areas we don't want to cut. So So I'm bringing the handle round now to match the angle I want to finish with. And now you want a chisel which is almost as wide as the narrowest part of the gap between the pins. Now if you set the chisel in the middle, then no matter what happens, you shouldn't cause any problem on the far side. About halfway down. If you've got a wide chisel, you should find that what's left to do is easy enough just to pair. Finish off from the other side. Just find this is much nicer if you're working on a hardwood. So just checking we've got it the right way round. Try the tails on there. That's a lovely fit. Well, hopefully you can see we've got good tight joints. We can still separate it, so if I can do that by hand, then I know I can put glue on and reassemble it, even if I need to tap it a little bit with a mallet. Super. Now, for the pin board, the planing direction again is away from the joint. That's lucky, just makes it a little bit easier. There we go. So there you have it, the through dovetail joint. It really isn't too complicated, but it does take practice to get it to look nice like this one.